Well, Pastor Roger, it's good to be with you today. We're recording this as a Sacred Encounter conversation, and you couldn't be in town for November 12th, and so we're recording this to be able to be shown in worship,
Correct.
but also for perpetuity's sake, so that others will be able to hear a little bit of your story today. This, of course, is being shown on Veterans Day weekend, and in conversation with you, it sounds like you haven't had much of an opportunity to be able to share your story with the congregation about your time in the service and some of the depth of what was held in that experience for you. Why do you think that is?
Well, to begin with, it's a fairly long story, but it also has to do with the time in our country and in the world in which the story takes place. So that was during the 16 years of the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the country about the direction of the war, what was going on then, and that affected all of the military service and veterans as well. And I think the country began to be weary of it all and was just really ready to be done when it was finally came to an end in 1975.
Yeah. And so weariness, and so not really the space that really needed to exist to be able to tell some of these stories. Right. Give us some background. Tell us about how you entered into military service, what was happening both in your life and the world at the time, and give us the basics of your time.
Well, just a little bit of brief background. I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force in August of 1969. I had actually signed papers in May of 1969, or excuse me, March of 1969, when I had passed my pre-induction physical to make me eligible for the draft. My student deferment would end as soon as I graduated the University of Nebraska at the end of May 1969. But the year before had been a very turbulent year in our country. Both Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had been assassinated that year, and I had also spent that summer as a student in Europe, and that brought me face to face with the context of the biggest preceding war. Of course, there was the Korean War intervening between that and the Vietnam War. But when I knew that my classification would change, I knew I had to make a decision. Would I act or be acted upon? I thought about enlisting in the National Guard. Both of my older brothers were guardsmen, but there was a long waiting list for entering the National Guard. And I also decided, well, do I really want to tie my life down with monthly training meetings and 2 weeks of summer camp every year for 8 years, or should I just make a decision and enlist in the regular armed forces? I had a degree in German, and an Air Force recruiter told me that the Air Force had a need for language specialists, and I thought, well, maybe there's a match here. So at any rate, I chose to enlist in the U.S. Air Force.
Okay. So I know during those years, it wasn't just about enlisting in the Air Force. You also had some other relational dynamics that were taking place. Tell us just a little bit briefly about how you met Jean during those years of getting ready to enlist in the Air Force.
Yeah. Well, I'll just add one detail from the previous question. The war was never far from us, regardless of what we were doing. People in my generation. In August of 1967, I had lost a cousin who was killed in action in Vietnam, and then a member of my school classes, all the way from grade school through high school, and a member of my confirmation class had been killed in April of 1968. So it was very close to home. Yeah. But I was I was going to become a language specialist. The Air Force didn't need German specialists at the time, but they did need Russian linguists. So I received orders to Syracuse, New York, and Syracuse University operated the Defense Department's East Coast Language Institute. And I was sent there for 9 months of intensive Russian, arrived in November of 1969, and would be there for 9 months. It was in May of the following year, May of 1970, I was just a little over halfway through my Russian language training. And it wasn't a very popular time for service members, military service members, which we were, although we were technically also students at Syracuse University. And this was just a month after students were shot by National Guardsmen at Kent State University. A couple of buddies and I were out one Saturday evening at a pub in North Syracuse, New York, called the Poorhouse North. And I was sort of crying in my beer about how difficult it was to meet young women in Syracuse, New York. After all that had been going on, and I said to a buddy sitting next to me, "You see that one over there with the long, pretty legs? I'll bet you a beer. She won't even talk to me." So I got myself a beer and walked over and introduced myself. She talked to me. And she talked to me for about the next hour and a half. And then she gave me her number, and we went out the next day, and then we went out 2 more times in the following week. Well, that was May 23rd, 1970, and on the following January 3rd, 1971, in the middle of winter, we were married in Buffalo, New York, and that'll be 53 years ago come January. So we're still going steady. She talked to me.
And even if you don't reference her, she'll be part of sort of the journey of your service, in some of the other stories that you may describe.
Well, absolutely. As I said, we were married on January 3rd, 1971. On the 12th of January, I took a train down from Connecticut to New York City and got on a 747 and went overseas to Turkey. So Gina and I didn't even have a chance to be together as a married couple for 9 days before I was shipped overseas. And she wouldn't arrive until the 2nd of April, 2.5 months later. And that's where we began married life together. We had never really been a married couple in this country before, and hadn't known each other that long either. So we had a real adventure.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of that move, you described to me a sacred encounter that you and Jean had relating to the housing that you ended up moving into there in Turkey. Can you tell me about where you lived and the family that you met there?
Yeah. I served at a little NATO base that was between the Turkish cities of Karamürsel and Yalova, a 2-hour ferry ride from Istanbul. Officially, this was a NATO base, although it was operated primarily by the U.S. Air Force. We did have some Army, some Navy, and even a couple of Marines stationed on the base as well, but there were way too many people assigned to that base for there to be housing for married couples such as Jean and I were, first-term people. But Jean and I really didn't want to live on base anyway, so we found an apartment in the city of Yalova, 15 miles from the base, and there were many GIs who rented apartments in the town of Yalova. And I found one couple who were going back to the States, so arranged to buy all of their furniture, what they weren't taking home with them, and I would take over the rent of that apartment. So they introduced me to Mazes and Ali Aydoğan, a Turkish couple who had an older daughter named Esin, who spoke a little bit of English, and two sons, Sedat and Ali. The Idawans rented 1 or 2 apartments in their little building of 6 apartments to American couples such as we were. And they also owned some land, and he made a bit of a living as a farmer raising vegetables, but also renting apartments. So here's this American couple, people from another culture, another country, another faith tradition who don't speak a word of Turkish except thank you and hello at the time. They rented us this apartment just on the basis of a hi and a handshake, with no lease, no tenant insurance, no credit card or bank account information, no mailing address, not even a phone number, just on the basis of hospitality and being kind to people who needed a home in their town. And they were such marvelous hosts to us over the 2.5 years that we lived there, as were so many of the shopkeepers and neighbors in this bustling little city of Yalova. So they took us in. And the really beautiful thing is that they didn't even dream of taking advantage of us. Our rent was 450 Turkish lira a month. That's $32 US, which was a miracle and a godsend, because when we first started living with them, my total taxable income for the year 1970 was about $1,930. And it would only go up to about $2,800 a year the next year, with a married spouse as a dependent, and one step up in promotion. So that $32 a month rent was a lifesaver for us. Yeah. They didn't take advantage of us at all.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there was opportunities for learning culture, learning different ways of being in the world through those relationships and those interactions.
Oh, true. You were never more than a block or 2 from a neighborhood bakery in Yalova, and never more than 3 or 4 blocks from a fresh produce stand and some just fabulous restaurants that the local people would dine in. So we had an opportunity to interact with all of those folks, and they were so delighted when you took the initiative to learn some of the Turkish language and to be able to communicate that way. So it was really our economy. It was our home. Yeah. And so often when you would go into a shop that you hadn't been in before you could even do business, the shop owner would call for the chai-chi, the young man in the neighborhood who would bring a tray with little glasses of tea on. You had to have tea together before you could do any business. It was just a way of saying welcome. Never experienced anything quite like that before or since. Yeah.
So living in a country engaged in relationships with folks that were clearly of a different religious background, different cultural background, what was your faith grounding like at the time? Or if you had to say a relationship with God or with a faith community in the midst of serving, in the midst of living in this other place, what was grounding you at the time? What was that like?
Well, to begin with, I went through some real faith questions about the time of my confirmation that I struggled with all the way through college, and just couldn't find answers for in the church. I couldn't find anybody to discuss these on the level that I needed to discuss them with. I had a terrific background in Scripture growing up in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod with our rigorous confirmation instruction program and going to 8 years of parochial school. But yes, I understood what the church said about sin and forgiveness and salvation. But then I tried to square that with the turbulence of the world and the war going on and so many intergenerational stresses at the time and say, okay, what now? Why doesn't the church have something to say about our country's history, about the whole civil rights struggle? I don't know that we even said a prayer after Martin Luther King was assassinated in our church. You've got a war that's been going on for a decade already, and I struggled to get direction for that because when I raised my right hand to enlist, I understood that this was a commitment that could involve either the giving of my life or the taking of someone else's life. These are pretty major questions in life. And we needed a better sense of what we were doing as a nation and why we were doing what we were doing, and I didn't feel like I was getting the moral guidance for those questions from the church at the time. So I've described it as spending some time in the wilderness.
Yeah.
And I was never alone in the wilderness because I was never not in conversation in that wilderness time. But God and I had some struggles, some dialogue, some yelling matches, some times of silence to go through so that the faith that was to be mine and not just what I had inherited from my parents, that could be something that matched the times we were living in. So that was a process that took years. But I was never not in conversation with God, although active participation in the church, well, that didn't even come into question. There is no church in the Republic of Turkey. There is no church in town. And it felt like there was a disconnect between where I was and the country I was serving, and all of that came into play at the time. So there was a lot to work through.
Yeah. Were there other questions beyond even just the questions of faith or how the faith community was responding to events in our country and in the world at that time? Were there other questions that were really central to what you were grappling with in those years?
Yeah, I guess I could distill them down into one basic question. What is life for? I mentioned that I had been in Europe the summer before I enlisted in the Air Force, and that took me to sites of such unfortunate history, walking across the grounds of the Nazi concentration camp at Dachau only 23 years after its liberation. And I thought to myself, my people did this. My German ethnic forebears, the people whose language I have a major in, Christian people did this. Where was the church? Where was the rest of society when all of this was going on? We have much bigger issues to be discussing with ourselves as a civilization, as Christians, than I hear being talked about. So that was a part of trying to figure out what life was for and how I fit into that and how I could find a faith relevant to that.
Yeah. Well, and here we are, 2023. In some ways, it feels many, many years and many, many experiences away from the years you're describing. But yet I know within myself that a lot of the questions that you're grappling with are the same things that I'm grappling with as well. What is life for in the midst of increasing global warfare and conflict? What is life for in the midst of sustainability questions for our ecological future as a species and as a planet? What is life for in the midst of even our own country, which is probably as divisive and as conflicted right now as maybe as it was in those years? I'm curious what questions then are still questions for you now? And how are you engaging in the present moment, thinking about the experiences you lived through then?
Well, all of those questions, unfortunately, are still with us, I think, and it's heartbreaking and shocking to realize how large they loom these days. One of the things I concluded for myself during that time of struggle years ago is I don't want to be a part of a church that has nothing to say. And that needs to be couched in some explanation. Of course, the church has something to say about Jesus Christ and sin and salvation and the love of God. But that needs to be a bigger, more connected way of saying something about what is going on in the world. Because I would like to think that there would be a way for us to not get to this same place again and again and again. I think we underestimate and undersell the love of God in Christ. To overcome all of these evils, the evil of conflicts that should have been averted in the first place. But that love also needs to inspire us and motivate us and empower us to be at a different place. No matter how broken things are, how tragic things are, to say, this is not the full story. This is not the end of it. There is something more for us here. And for us as the church to acknowledge our own inadequacies and failures, but say, Christ is calling. It is the love of Christ that can overcome this. Piece by piece, little by little, in one way or another. That's the only thing I know that gets us through this and gets us to a different place.
A lot of wisdom born out of experiences that are a full life's work and still going forward from here. Any other final reflections or thoughts you want to add as part of our conversation?
Well, I would say this. I think one of the issues that our country stumbled on during the Vietnam War is that we did not have a clear understanding of why this conflict was happening in the first place and what it was supposed to accomplish. And it seemed to me that we put a bit of a completely inappropriate burden on the people who served in the military at the time. It's as though we were asking our armed forces to not only deal with the armed conflict situation, but to somehow do a better job of thinking and being about what it means to be a citizen and what it means to be an American. And what it says to me is we need to recover a much better sense of citizenship and our responsibility as Americans, as citizens of the world. I came to the conclusion years ago that we tend to confuse two issues. We tend to confuse security with freedom. Our military services can help us maintain the security of our country against external threats and even internal threats. But freedom is something else. And to illustrate that, I would say, let's just take a look at North Korea today. I think North Korea is very secure. I don't think they'll ever be attacked by Russia or China or Japan or even South Korea. But are the people free? Yeah. And only the people can create and maintain freedom. Yeah. Security helps to be able to do that, but this is our responsibility as human beings, as citizens, and as Americans.
Well, and may I add, as people of faith, to be able to say that this is our work, to care for those that are left vulnerable, of which I'm hearing you say, I think in multiple generations, the people that we have relied upon to provide that security, we have not offered the appropriate level of care for, and we see that in the vulnerability of veterans in our communities. But it's also on all of us to create that way of being that allows for each person to be free and to create that way of being.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm really glad you brought up that point, because it wasn't until after 9/11 that anybody ever said to me, "Thank you for your service." And it's not even something that we expected to hear when we returned from overseas. I was shocked, I was startled, I didn't even know how to respond or react to that. But that's not really what I'm looking for. It's to be mindful of the burden that may be carried by people from whom we expect this kind of service and this kind of commitment. If you've got time for one little story here and maybe a poem to...
And then I think that's an appropriate way to close.
One of the first things I got involved in after Gina and I moved to the Portland area in 1987 was Donna Grady, a member of this congregation, linked me up with Bob Dewey, who was then the executive director of what was known as Lutheran Family Service at the time, Lutheran Community Services. I really didn't have skills to offer, but somehow he convinced me that I could take a place on the board of directors. Well, okay, that led to a trip down to our office at Klamath Falls with Pastor Jim Erickson, who was pastor of Maxburg Lutheran Church at the time. And that office maintained group and individual counseling for Vietnam veterans and their families. And that was such a moving experience, because to a person, every one of those veterans in the groups down there said, "I would not be alive today if it were not for this group, this service." And that led me finally to take a deeper look at life through their eyes and what they had experienced. And the sad fact for us is that at least 3 times as many veterans came home from Vietnam alive and ended up taking their own lives as those lost to us in war. So what they shared with us down there enabled me to step back a little bit and to see life through their eyes. And so the very first thing I ever wrote about the whole Vietnam War period that finally led to writing and producing a play here 25 years ago was a poem simply titled "Vet." And this is dedicated to all of those who made it home, but didn't make it because somebody wasn't there for them in the right way. The time never stopped, but it seemed to come and go inverted. Nightmarish nights of terror, unnerving days between. He died in the spirit at 19, too wounded to feel the pain. Injury went unseen, and a youthful dream was left to rot in stillborn, muddy fear. His body returned, warm and breathing, but the eyes told pale death within. Never certain if it ended, if anything else had been. With alcohol, he built a wall, held together with pills and pain. People never got near, let alone inside. They never cared to once they'd tried. And somewhere the fog would close again, remind him of the rain. Chills and sweat and pain, bloody mud and rain, the fog would close. Sometime between his childhood and early Friday afternoon, the fog came in, and he walked off the edge of the world. No one who has ever borne such a burden should ever be alone. It's where the love of Christ calls us to be.
Pastor Roger, thank you for sharing your story. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you for your patience, your interest, and your understanding. Blessings.